According to all reports, the United States has the highest incarceration rate on the planet. At the current moment, more than 7.3 million people are either paroled, on probation, or incarcerated. Although African Americans comprise only 12% of the U.S. population, they make up 41% of the nation's prison population. Joining me to discuss the incarceration crisis are Barry Scheck, an attorney for the Innocence Project, Monifa Bandele, program manager for the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, and Michael Cord, Philadelphia criminal trial lawyer and activist. Thank you all for joining us. I think the most stunning number that I've ever seen is the fact that in 1970, there were only somewhere between 250 and 300,000 people incarcerated in the whole country. 40 years later, 2.5 million people are incarcerated. How do we get from 250,000 in 1970 to 2.5 million in 2011? How does that happen?
Very simple. Two things happened within our sentencing system. The first was mandatory minimum sentences in state and federal courts. Just completely took discretion away from judges, and if you committed certain kinds of crimes, you were going to go to prison for long periods, period. That's it. And those were most often associated with drug laws. And the drug laws alone during that period are what accounts for the huge increase in incarceration.
Monifa, the war on drugs began in 1984, and over that time, as Barry points out, we've seen this skyrocket in incarceration rates, particularly among African-American people, but really among poor people. Why is the war on drugs so central to this?
If you looked in communities across class lines and across race, you'll find drugs. You'll find drug users and you'll find drug sellers. But what's happened is that the way that our policing systems are designed in cities is that there's a racial profiling of communities with high numbers of African American and Latino people. So you see more drug convictions coming out of particular communities, which will give you the illusion that there's more drug use.
So why is race so important in the criminal justice system? Why does race play such a big factor?
In terms of race, you know, people often say, well, Mike, you always play the race card, and why you always talk about race when it comes to the criminal justice system? My answer is simple. I ask everybody, the first question I pose when they say race doesn't matter is, let's say tomorrow you have to go to court as a defendant anywhere, Alaska, Alabama, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, and you have the choice to go as a black man defendant or a white man defendant. Which would you choose? Nobody's blacker than me, but I'd be white on trial, no doubt
So
about
nobody
it.
taking no...
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's an interesting observation.
So the numbers are crazy, but they're crazier when race comes into the mix.
I always joke, I said if I went to Princeton University on a Friday night, I could arrest people for public drunkenness, public urination, possession of marijuana at the same rate that I could in any black neighborhood. But we're not looking at Princeton University for those things, or any other university. So why the overemphasis on black neighborhoods?
Well, I mean, the reason is obvious. I mean, you know, if you're, you know, they've done all these studies of racial profiling, you know, on the New Jersey Turnpike and all kinds of different thoroughfares. And, you know, the numbers show that there are more white people carrying drugs down the New Jersey Turnpike than black people. But no matter how many times we try to reform the system, more black people are being pulled over for it.
And this isn't just happenstance. There's a pipeline into the prisons in the country that links directly back to communities that have high levels of police officers in there. There's an over-militarization of areas. So people's entire communities are profiled, racial profiling is happening. And that pipeline, if you look at a city, like let's say, for example, New York City, there are 3 communities in New York City where 70% of the prisoners throughout the state of New York come from. And it's no surprise that those are also communities where you have...
You said three communities, and 70% of the state's prison population come from these three communities.
These 3 areas, these 3
God.
counties in New York City. And so what you see also is that those are the same counties where you have heavy policing, where you have special programs like the Street Crimes Unit, which was responsible for the killing of Amadou Diallo. So there's an intense level of policing that helps to fuel people into these arraignment processes and on to the prisons.
One of the really fascinating things in terms of trying to change this and break this bottleneck is Andrew Cuomo, just elected governor of New York, said something sensible. You know, we have to cut budgets. And we have prisons upstate New York where, you know, they're being underutilized. You know, we have to close some of those down. He's having so much trouble trying to close these prisons. All of a sudden, people are saying, oh, this is hurting jobs in upstate New York. There is literally a prison industrial complex that has an economic interest.
And that's an important point. And that's an important point that we need to think about. And Michael, I know you've done a lot of work on the criminal justice system, both on the activist side and as an attorney. I mean, what does it mean for there to be a financial stake in prisons, as Barry just pointed out, that there are actually jobs attached? I mean, we go to some cities where towns would shut down if these prisons shut down. How do we make sense of that, too? What do we do about that?
Well, I mean, there's money to be made in the prison industrial complex. There's no doubt about that. But you would think that if it was only about the money, then the white boys would go to jail just like the black guys go to jail. But that doesn't happen.
So I think the key link in this is that there's an economic factor, but then there's political power and representation. And that's sharply linked to high incarceration rates. We keep focusing on the individual's loss of rights and political voice, which is a travesty nonetheless. But the entire community's political power is diminished when high levels of people from that community are incarcerated. In many states around the country, once you get a felony conviction, your right to vote is taken away from you. And you have Virginia and Mississippi in particular, where 1 to 3 and 1 to 4 black men in those states are disenfranchised. Now imagine the political voice and the political power of your community if 25% of the males in it can't vote.
Barry, much of your work with the Innocence Project is dealing with people who've been wrongfully convicted. If you were to guess, what percentage of the people incarcerated right now would you say are wrongfully convicted?
There are some pretty staggering numbers. There have been a number of studies, and people, have guesstimated. I mean, they've done a little better than that, but maybe what you want to be conservative, say 3% of people are wrongfully convicted, may very well be higher.
That's still close to 100,000 people.
That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people.
When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, and I also want to talk about some solutions. Stay right there. We'll be right back.
I think once you educate a person and give a person a job, 90% of the crime will stop.
Is brought to you by
Michael Cord. We're talking about the incarceration crisis, and we're moving from analysis now to solutions. Team, please tell me, what can we do now? People obviously will say, don't commit the crime. People will say, be responsible, don't do drugs, don't steal. All of us, I think, are in agreement on that. But moving beyond that point, what do we do in terms of this mass incarceration thing?
Well, what's the solution? Solution is a multi-step approach. First, education. And not just education, but paid education. Even if it's minimum wage, to pay these folks to come in to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. But for the black folks, not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but history courses, cultural courses, to find out about African-American history and ancient African history. Then beyond that, paid job training and then job placement. I think once you educate a person and give a person a job, 90% of the crime will stop.
We also have to support sound policy around prison and incarceration. I mean, we have to look at the sentencing laws in every state, the federal laws, and try and get our elected officials to back away from this tough on crime stance that they're taking as a means for lowering crimes in communities. It's not true. It doesn't work. Research has shown that that's not what you use to rid a community of crime. There's other sensible things like better education systems and the like.
Well, one of the really interesting political developments is that recently there's a group called Right on Crime. And a number of these people on the right recognize that there are too many people in prison, that these are sclerotic, broken down bureaucracies, that we have to get people out of there.
It costs too much.
Costs too much, but also we have to have reentry programs, sane parole systems, get rid of these mandatory minimum laws, do something sensible about treating narcotics, and reduce the volume in the system. And so I think that that is a really important coalition for us to look to.
Well, thank you all for a spirited panel. I hope to have you all back again soon. We'll be back with more Our World with Black Enterprise in a bit. That wraps it up for us here at Our World with Black Enterprise. I'm Marc Lamont Hill here at the 6th Annual Black Enterprise Women of Power Summit. Be sure to visit us at blackenterprise.com. Also, make sure you check me out on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.